And then finally, I just want to note that the FDA is part of the PHS agencies, but this sponsor does have some additional requirements that are related to clinical research that is used in part to support marketing applications of human drugs, biological products, or devices. Before we move on, I do want to note some regulations that I am not mentioning today, but may be pertinent to your institution's conflict of interest policy. And that is your state conflict of interest regulations. So here at UCF, we're part of the state university system, and so we must also abide by the state of Florida Code of Ethics statutes. Since participants here today are from various states and are comprised of both public and private universities, I'm not going to go over that information in detail, but just be aware that it can influence the reporting requirements at your institution. So now we're going to get into the who, what, when, where, how, and why of the PHS conflict of interest policies. So why do we care about conflicts of interest? Well, the purpose of the regulation is to provide a reasonable expectation that the design, conduct, and reporting of research will be free from the bias of investigators' conflicts of interest. It protects the integrity of research and public trust in science. I myself am quite passionate about science, and I'm so grateful for all the innovations that we have in our society as a result of science. But we'll lose the trust of the public in science if it's not free from political, ideological, financial, or corporate influences. And so the PHS regulations directly address the potential financial influences. So who must follow these requirements? The PHS regulations apply both to the investigator and to the institution. So an investigator is defined as the project director or principal investigator and any other person, regardless of title or position, who is responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of research. So this can even include collaborators and consultants. So notice here that a faculty member does not need to hold the title of PI or co-PI to be included in these requirements. The regulation applies to all responsible for design, conduct, and reporting. So in the following slides, we will talk about what needs to be disclosed, but I want to pause for a moment and talk about the institution's responsibilities. So the institution must have a published, compliant conflict of interest policy. In addition, the institution is responsible for ensuring compliance with the regulations and for ensuring that investigators are completing their conflict of interest training every 4 years. Training must also be completed if any of the institution's policies change. The institution is also responsible for ensuring compliance with the policies and taking necessary actions to mitigate any potential conflicts. And these responsibilities flow down to subrecipients who must also be compliant. And finally, the institution is responsible for reporting any identified conflicts to the agency. So now the good stuff. What must they disclose? What financial interests must the investigator let the agency know about? So the Public Health Service indicates that the investigator must disclose his or her significant financial interest and those of the spouse and dependent children. So a significant financial interest is defined as one of the following interests that appears reasonably related to the investigator's institutional responsibilities. And so I'm going to share the slide that discusses the what. So first, if the investigator has, if the entity they're disclosing is a publicly traded entity, they must disclose it if any remuneration they receive in the previous 12 months, plus any equity interest as of the date of the disclosure exceeds $5,000. If the entity that they have an interest in is a private entity, non-publicly traded, they must disclose it if any of the remuneration they receive exceeds $5,000 and any equity in it. And then for intellectual property rights and interest, upon receipt of income related to such rights and interests, they must disclose that. And the occurrence of any reimbursed travel or sponsored travel. And that's travel that's paid on behalf of the investigator. So this disclosure requirement, though, the travel piece does not apply to travel that's reimbursed or sponsored by a federal, state, or local government agency, or if it's funded through a sponsored research contract, grant or contract. There are some reporting exclusions. For example, investigators do not need to report any salary or royalties from the institution that they're disclosing from. They don't need to report any kind of investment vehicle such as mutual funds or retirement accounts, as long as they're not the person directly controlling those investments. And they also do not need to report any income from seminars, lectures, teaching engagements, service on advisory committees or panels that are paid by the US federal, state, or local government, or from an institution of higher education. So when is the next one? So when do we do this? So we disclose significant financial interest no later than the time of application. And then the investigator is required to submit an annual update. And if there is a change or a new significant financial interest, the investigator should report it within 30 days of the new interest. Now is the how. How do we do all of this? So the regulations indicate that each institution should provide consistent guidelines for the designated institutional official to determine whether the significant financial interest is related to funded research, and if so, whether the significant financial interest is a financial conflict of interest. So at UCF, once a significant financial interest is identified through the disclosure process, my office reviews the disclosure to determine if the significant financial interest is related to funded research. And there are two tools that we use for this analysis. We conduct a research portfolio review, and we utilize a research conflict of interest committee. If there is a financial conflict of interest, the research conflict of interest committee will recommend a management plan. And so we're going to be discussing these tools in the upcoming slides. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of best practices in identification and management. So how does the institution ensure that all of these significant financial interests are disclosed? The first line of defense is the annual disclosure process. So at UCF, we have an electronic annual disclosure system, and the key consideration, some key considerations to keep in mind in this tool is who fills it out and what questions you ask. So you will recall that the PHS regulations state that all who are responsible for DCR must complete a disclosure. So at UCF, we identify these folks at the beginning of our disclosure cycle. And then throughout the year, we have a report that alerts us to new employees on sponsored projects who are required to disclose. And then the questions that we ask on the disclosure form are especially important. We want the questions worded to elicit useful information in making determinations on both the significant financial interest itself and how it is related to their research. So for example, at UCF, we ask specifically, the questions on that table, if they have equity in a private, entity, what the value is, so we can see if they meet the threshold for the significant financial interest. And then we also ask them to describe how that interest is similar to or different than their sponsored research. So the annual disclosure casts a very wide net. Another tool is an ancillary review at the time of proposal. And so at UCF, anyone who's named on a proposal must answer 2 questions in what we call our proposal SMART form. And that first question asks if they are responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of research on the project. And the second question asks if they have any conflict related to the project. So if someone answers yes to having a conflict related to the project, the proposal specialist will send an ancillary review in our system to my office to review it. So in many of these cases, our office is already aware of the potential conflict because of the annual disclosure, but the ancillary review is a second line of defense. And this second review allows us to review any management plan that may be put in place and ensure that the project conforms to the expectations in the plan. And it also alerts us to any potential reporting requirements. So in some cases, we may be still working on the management plan at the time of proposal. And so in those cases, we'll put a note in the ancillary review that we want to review it again if it is awarded. So at that time, we can then go and check and ensure that the management requirements are all in place for the project. So we can have an ancillary review at the time of proposal, and then we can request one at the time of award if needed. So besides ensuring review at these 3 key milestones, which is an annual review, proposal, and award, another important tool in identification is training. So as we all know, faculty members are super busy. They're not always familiar with the myriad of federal regulations that we're tasked to keep up with. And so it's important for us to provide them with training and tools to help them know what they need to disclose. So one of the tools that we have at UCF is a handy disclosure matrix that provides examples of what should be disclosed and what should be excluded. Finally, it is very important to build relationships with our partner departments. So for example, the IRB or the IACUC office may be working on protocols where they become aware of a potential conflict, and they can get in touch with our office, and it's just so important to build those relationships for them to say, hey, this might be a conflict. Let me just make sure that the conflict of interest office knows about it. The tech transfer office also is oftentimes the first folks who hear about a startup company. So a faculty member may get in touch with them because they have a patent that they filed, and now they want to start a business and they want to license it. So the tech transfer loops me in to let me know that the faculty member is interested in starting a business, and I can get right in touch with the faculty member at that time and give them some tips on what they're going to need to do, what kind of controls they need to put in place, how to define their roles so that we can set up a solid management plan for them. General counsel and your compliance offices may encounter potential conflicts they can alert you to. And finally, all of you guys on this call, research administrators at the department and central offices, may hear about a potential conflict that should be disclosed. And we really appreciate it when you guys reach out to our office and let us know about it. We can get in touch with a faculty member, ask some additional questions, and have them disclose it so that we can begin working on a solution. So let's talk a little bit about that portfolio review tool that I mentioned earlier. So the portfolio review is a summary that we put together to try to determine the relatedness of the disclosed financial interest and the faculty member's research. So we run reports in our system that identify all of the faculty members' current awards, their pending proposals, any intellectual property agreements that they may have or licenses they may have. And we do this for both the investigator and for the entity. So we're trying to look at the relationship between the investigator, the university, and the entity all together. We asked the faculty member questions about their research area and how it's similar or different than the activities of the company. We'll look at their scope of work and their awards. So we'll go right to those proposals that have been filed. We'll go to the award documents, and we'll look at the statement of work and try to compare that to the business's activities to see what may be similar or different. And we can also look at some outside sources. We'll look at online publications, presentations, press releases that may have been given about the faculty member's business, company websites, and the State Division of Corporations is a tool that we'll use to try to understand the relationship between the faculty member and the company. We ask specific questions about who else may be involved in the company. For example, are any of the faculty members graduate students working at the company? This helps us to identify any potential academic conflicts. And finally, we conduct a foreign red flag review if there is a foreign entity that is disclosed. And so for this, we run the foreign entity through a database to ensure it is not a denied entity. And for those companies that are located in high-risk countries, we may also do some additional internet searches or reviews of publications to try to determine the exact nature of the faculty member's relationship with the entity. We would like to see if they have an appointment there, if we're really looking out for foreign talent programs, those type of things that are hot topics in the news right now. So we also work very closely with our Office of International Collaboration and Export Controls on those disclosures. In fact, we kind of run the preliminary assessment, and then they dig in even deeper. So that's another really good department or partner to build relationships with. Now, some of our conflicts of interest are rather obvious, even to a layperson, but there are those that require review by the experts. So for this reason, we've assembled a research conflict of interest committee at UCF. So the committee is composed of faculty with various scientific expertise. And we also have a representative from the tech transfer office on the committee to provide input on intellectual property. And then my team, the compliance team, is on the committee to help the faculty members navigate the regulations. So, you know, in some cases where my team may not understand all the scientific jargon in the statement of work, or how the particular science may or may not be related to the company's product or business activities, this is where the input from the committee is critical. The committee reviews the identified significant financial interest, and they try to determine if the conflict rises to the level of a financial conflict of interest. So the way the regulations define a financial conflict of interest is that the interest could directly and significantly impact the design, conduct, and reporting of research. So this is kind of where the committee digs in and discusses how significant, how directly is the science related. So once these conflicts are identified, and the committee says, yes, there's a financial conflict of interest here, the next thing they do is they determine what is the best management plan to apply to these conflicts. So the regulations indicate that institutions must manage the conflict. So managing means taking an action to address a financial conflict of interest, which can include reducing or eliminating the financial conflict of interest to ensure, to the extent possible, that the design, conduct, and reporting of research will be free from bias. So that's out of the PHS regulations. So some of the common practices to mitigate these conflicts, number one on the list is for public disclosure. So when a faculty member has an identified financial conflict of interest, their management plan will dictate that in any of their presentations or publications that they should disclose that to the audience. Let the folks who are interpreting the research results know about the conflict ahead of time. It can also include disclosure to human subjects. So the investigator may be required to notify the human subjects of his potential conflict in the informed consent protocol. So if a human subject's going to be in a protocol, they need to know up front that the investigator may be conflicted. Also, disclosure to subordinates. So at UCF, we require faculty with a financial conflict of interest to disclose the conflict to their subordinates in a template that's part of their management plan. It's called the Exhibit A. And the exhibit provides the employee a person to contact if they have any concern about the conflict of interest. So again, it's just one of the key parts of a conflict of interest is just disclosure, making folks aware of it. There could be an appointment of an independent monitor. So the monitor may review the design, conduct, and reporting of research to ensure it's unbiased. And we could require modification of the research plan. So in this type of control, the committee may recommend that the investigator remove themselves from key parts of the research protocol. For example, perhaps the conflicted PI will not be involved in the selection of human subjects or the collection of data. And lastly, the committee may suggest that another unconflicted individual lead the project, or the faculty member may need to divest themselves of the conflict. And so I'm going to pause at this part and ask if anybody has any other best practices that they use at their university that they're aware of. And you can type it in the chat. So I have one question. Who is the contact for research assistants to report to if they have questions on the conflict? So in most cases, it's the Associate Dean of Research for the college that they're in. That's at UCF, that's usually who it is. And I also had a question about sharing the disclosure matrix with the group. And I can do that. It is out on our public website. So I will maybe on my slideshow, or I'll provide it to Jennifer when they distribute the handouts to everybody at the end of the conference.
Thank you.
Any other management practices that your institutions may use that you'd like to share? All right. Well, you know, having a management plan in and of itself is not enough. We also have to manage the management plan. So at UCF, we do this through self-reporting for the majority of our faculty members that have a management plan. And in this type of reporting, the faculty member will file an annual report each year. And this, we have a template for it. And the template asks them specific questions about the activities of the entity. And we're zeroing in on any changes that may have happened from when their plan was approved. So we'll ask them, for example, do you have any new graduate students who also work at the company? You know, maybe they were hired after the management plan was put in place, and we need to be sure that we look at that. In fact, in their management plan, they're not supposed to do that, but we ask the questions to see if they are in compliance with the management plan. So for some high risk conflicts, though, we may confirm compliance through an independent monitor report. So in those cases, there's a report that the monitor does, and they go out to look at if the person has followed their management plan. And it may also involve a review of their publications to confirm that they're disclosing their conflicts in their publications. And the institution does have some responsibilities if non-compliance is found. So the PHS regulations require a retrospective review. So that retrospective review will go back and look to see if you know, if there's been any bias in the research, and then that would need to be reported to the agency. All right, and now we have a case study. So this was reported recently in a NSF report, the last quarter of 2021. And there was an associate professor who failed to disclose his association with his company to the university. And so an employee of that associate professor's company happened to manage both the university lab, and so he was also employed by the university, and he had production and sales activities for the company. So unfortunately, this employee mischarged costs to the NSF grant because he was commingling university and company activities. And so the associate professor resigned, and the university returned about $650,000 to the National Science Foundation. And they recommended that the associate professor be disbarred, him and his company. So one of the things that we really look at closely when we're reviewing these management plans are the use of the university resources. So the questions for this case would be, what opportunities would there have been for the university to identify this conflict? Does anybody have any guesses out there they'd like to throw up in the chat? Or feel free to shout out. All right, well, I'll help you out with this one. So the first line of defense for all conflicts of interest is the annual disclosure. So that would be the first thing we would expect this to float up on. The faculty member should have disclosed this on his annual conflict that he had an outside entity, and his management plan would dictate that he should not have employees that report to him also working at the company. So my next question, if I were investigating this, would be to see, did the lab employee investigate, did the lab employee disclose his outside employment? And this would really come down to finding out if we ask the lab employee to fill out a disclosure. So as you remember, I said two of the important things when you're looking at your annual disclosures: who fills it out and what questions you ask. So this is really important to be able to identify anybody who has design, conduct, and reporting responsibilities on a grant, because we want them filling out a disclosure form. And then as far as asking the right questions on our disclosure forms, we specifically ask questions about if the entity has other university employees working there. And we also ask specifically about subordinates. So just being sure that you're eliciting the information that you need that will bubble up those conflicts. Also, if this person had been hired after the management plan was put in place, we could have identified this on an annual report. So each year, as I mentioned, we have them do an annual report that lets us know of any changes. And in that, we ask about subordinates who may work at the entity. So it would have bubbled up there. And another potential places this may have bubbled up is we do go out and look at company websites when we're doing management plans. So if the person had disclosed this and we were doing our research, sometimes those company websites will have a list of employees, and so we may be able to identify other people there that we need to review their role at the company. Let's see, I have a question in the chat. What happens if your PI receives an award from a foundation that gets its funding from a company that the PI is consulting with or serves as an unpaid advisor to? Do you routinely consider the source of the funding for the foundation's grant money in evaluating your PI's conflicts of interest? So, yes, we do look at all consulting activities. So at UCF, our disclosure form elicits not only just entities that they have a significant financial interest in, but we ask them to disclose all outside activities. So my first question would be if the remuneration that the PI is getting from this outside company exceeds $5,000, it would come up on the significant financial interests. But then next, if they were under $5,000, they would still disclose it in another question on our form. And so when that comes up, we do go and run a research portfolio. So we would look and see what all awards that this company has provided to UCF and the foundation. We look at all awards at UCF or our foundation. And then we look at the PI's role on those potential awards. And then if he's paid on both of them, if he's paid at UCF through a sponsored research project and he's paid as a consultant outside of UCF's sponsored programs with that same company, we would definitely look at the relatedness of those things. It would definitely raise a lot of questions, and we would be looking into that, find out why it wasn't run through UCF, how it's different, those sort of questions. Did that help? All right. If this had been identified earlier, how could we have managed this conflict? So the first thing is, if this had been identified earlier, we likely would have recommended a reassignment of duties. In general, it's a pretty big conflict to have a person reporting to you in both your UCF, your university role, and your company role, especially if there are activities that kind of cross over. So we would definitely look at reassignment of duties and possibly additional oversight. So we could have an independent monitor who would who would review those activities, maybe somebody to look over the financials. So those might be some things that would be recommended. Any other ideas for how this conflict could be managed? All right, I got a quiet group today. So, oh, hey, Michelle, can you remind us what reassignment of duties means? So it could be that the person is assigned to another PI, in the lab. So, maybe they need to be reassigned to a different supervisor, so that there's some oversight there. So that's what reassignment of duties means. Reassigning them to another unit. Okay. All right. Let's see. Are the independent monitors usually committee members? Not necessarily. A lot of times it will be somebody in that specific college. So the associate dean of research, maybe an independent monitor. In some cases, it's helpful for the independent monitor to have the same type of scientific background as the PI, because they're going to be reviewing their science and their design, conduct, and reporting of that particular kind of research. So it's really helpful for them to have an understanding of that research area. All right. So I have a quiet group today, so I kind of flew right through some of those slides. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes. In the case study, it was an audit by the National Science Foundation. That is how that conflict bubbled up. So when the NSF was reviewing that particular sponsored project, they realized that there were costs charged to the grant that were not from the university. And so that's how that came through.
Michelle, I had a situation one time where a conflict was identified when we went to the Secretary of State website and found that someone that was contributing to the conduct, design, and research was listed as an officer on it was a foundation. Someone else raised the foundation on the foundation funding. So they were listed as, I can't remember if they were secretary or treasurer, and they have multiple years in there sometime, depending on how each state handles their freedom of disclosure. But here in the Sunshine State, it's easy to find information. So, and I just wonder if that's a resource that you check sometimes.
Yes, we do. In our research portfolio review that we put together for each disclosure, we go to our division of corporations, which is sunbiz.org here in Florida, and we do a search on the entity, and we'll look to see who the officers are, and try to map out what the relationship looks like between the investigator and the entity.
Has anyone else got any tips or comments or situations that they've dealt with that they'd like to discuss? Because we've got Michelle's ear for another 15 minutes if we need it.
Oh, so Greg has a question about what's the difference between mitigating, managing, or eliminating a conflict of interest. So eliminating it's when you're going to, we could ask the faculty member to divest themselves of the interest. So if they have stock in the company, we can ask them to sell their stock, or if they have ownership in the company, they could, leave the company. So that's how we could eliminate it. Or perhaps instead they want to not be on the sponsored project. So they may ask somebody else to take on the PI role on the sponsored project. So that's how they could eliminate the conflict. To manage it is to go into that management plan. It's just reviewing it, making sure that they're being open about the about the conflict. So they're disclosing it in their publications. They're disclosing it to people that report to them. We monitor it throughout the years as we look at their annual updates. And so that's the best way to manage it. Mitigating and managing, I would say, are pretty closely together. Mitigating it may be like changing the roles of the PI. So it doesn't require consistent managing. You don't have to keep looking at it. You've changed something so it's not as risky. So that's how mitigating and managing would be different. So let's see.
More questions.
All right. So how did you gain all your knowledge, coursework or hands-on review of the guidelines, or just on-the-job training to educate yourself? So, so I'll tell you a little bit about my background. Before I was in research administration, I was an internal auditor. And back at my previous institution, internal audit kind of managed the conflict of interest process at that time. It wasn't research specific, but that's kind of where I started learning about conflicts of interest. Then, you know, as I was in research administration, of course, I became more familiar with the federal regulations. My previous institution, we did not, it was smaller, so we did not have a department dedicated to that. And so when this position came up at UCF, I was really interested because it seemed to blend my internal audit background and my research administration background. And from there, it was a lot of on-the-job learning. There are some really great resources. I recently went to an SRAI conference in New Orleans, and there was a whole track on compliance, and there were many, I want to say 4 or 5 sessions on conflicts of interest. There's also a great resource with the AAMC where they have a, and I'm not, I'm just plugging them because they were so helpful to me. It's called Conflict of Interest 101. And it's I think they're doing it again in April. It's a really great resource to learn about a lot more in detail about these regulations. Yeah, and then just getting your hands in it. Each conflict is really unique, so you have to look at it from different angles and just kind of learn as you go on some of them. Okay, let's see, got some more questions here. Is it a COI if a faculty is paid as a consultant from an entity that another faculty has a subaward with? Not necessarily. Faculty members, each institution has its own policies on consulting and outside activities, but generally most institutions allow their faculty members to consult as an outside activity. So we'd have to look to see what that relationship is like. We'd have to do a little digging, find out what the consulting work is about, if it's related to the subaward. Yeah, I just have a lot of questions to ask. So it depends, like most things, research administration. Does the PI need to be completely removed from the program, meaning no involvement, or just changing the PI from being the lead investigator? It just depends on what the conflict is that we're looking at. Doesn't necessarily mean they need to be removed totally from the project. It could be that they're just not the lead, that there's somebody else who's providing oversight, but it just depends on the relationship between the entity and the faculty member and what other controls there may be put in place. Maybe they will stay as the lead, but they'll have an independent monitor who oversees it. Just depends on the specifics of the project. For disclosure forms, how do you word your questions to help investigators understand what's needed? Often a push-pull between easily understood text and policy definitions. Yes, this is very key part. It's always tricky to get those worded just right. I was lucky to join UCF with a very well-worded disclosure form, but we are looking, we're moving to a new software program, so we are looking at new ways to word things to make it a little more clear to the faculty members. I think it's just practice. Just from being here my short time, I can see, oh darn, I wish we would have asked that. So I find myself going back and asking the same questions to the faculty members over and over. So I've made a little tickler in my brain that says, okay, when we're getting out there to change the wording on these forms, we need to add this because I ask it every time and we haven't asked it. So some of it's just, practice, experience.
I think another thing that is helpful is to always remember that English may not be the first language of our faculty, and some words that we use can be ambiguous. So having a couple of people read over it, a couple of faculty read over it and ask them, and not just with this, but anything we want the faculty to fill out, ask them if they understand it. They will not hesitate to tell you if it can be improved.
Yes, that's a great point, Jennifer. We do, as we're going into our new software system, we do have a faculty group who is reviewing our new questions so that we can get some input from them on whether they're worded well. And we got some really candid and great feedback from them so far. And also another tool that we use is we do have a list of definitions. So if they want to know, okay, what, one of the questions asked if they receive any compensation from a foreign entity. So they may go, well, how do I know if it's a foreign entity? So we give a definition of how they can tell, what a foreign entity is. So definitions are also helpful. And Greg, the name of that organization that sponsors the Conflict of Interest 101 is AAMC. And I believe that stands for American Association of Medical Colleges, if I'm correct. And yep. Let's see, do you have any hard stops in your program that cannot be managed? That's a really great question. I have not run into any so far. We always seem to find a way to have a way to manage it, whether we ask, them to have an independent monitor. I would say that most conflicts can probably be managed. I know it also depends on the risk tolerance of the university itself. For example, I know that Stanford University does not allow conflicts with startups. The investigator has to totally they have to totally close up that research program at the university if they're going to do a startup company in the same field. So we don't have that at UCF. So yeah, I haven't run into any so far. I'm sure in my career I will eventually run into one, but nothing's coming to mind right at this moment. Let's see, do you have any guidance resources for helping your committee understand the compelling circumstances evaluation when determining if a conflict is manageable? I do have a guide that I put together for our research conflict of interest committee. And you guys can email me if you'd like to see it. I can give you my email address, or I can provide it to Jennifer if she wants to send it out to everybody. It's kind of more of an internal document, but I don't mind sharing it. But it provides them with a chart that gives some examples of what is what they want to look at. For example, it'll say, if the faculty member has an equity interest in a company and their research is investigating a product that company owns, yes, that's going to be quite an important conflict to look at. So we have kind of these little matrix to help us determine the level of risk in it. So we also discuss a lot about roles, clearly defining the role of our investigators. So that's another thing that guidance I give them in the committee meeting. So we'll say, okay, at the entity, the person is the president, they sign agreements, these are the things they do. And then at the university, these are the things they do. We want to make sure that they're not signing, they're not negotiating with the university if they're a university employee. So they may have to, this is an example of a reassignment of duties where they may need to say, okay, instead I'm going to have the vice president of the company negotiate with the university instead. Since I'm employed by them, I can't negotiate with them. So some things like that we provide guidance on. let's see. I think that might be all the questions. But yes, I can provide that guidance document that we give our committee if anybody would like to see that.
I'm sure everyone would be happy to have any resource you're willing to provide. I think the resources of where you can learn more are also very valuable.
Okay.
Are there any further questions? Michelle, I just want to thank you again for sharing your expertise with us this morning. And as you can see, UCF is very fortunate to have Michelle here. This is an area that can be very sticky, and it takes a lot of important critical thinking skills and a little bit of you've got to have a little bit of Agatha Christie, Miss Marple in you to find all the information sometimes, and she's able to do that. But she does it in a way that's very considerate so that the faculty enjoy working with her as much as a faculty member can enjoy working with someone who's asking them administrative questions. So that's quite a skill in itself. But thank you again for coming, and we will be sending these resources out to the research community. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your attendance.